Welcome to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to FDA Imports, cross-border compliance with attorney Benjamin L. England. Ben is a former FDA attorney with over 40 years at the intersection of FDA, customs, and federal regulatory enforcement. And today, Ben and I are talking about why FDA compliance alone may not protect importers from customs enforcement problems. I'm Sean O'Connor, and we're going to get into it. Ben, it's good to see you.
Hey, Sean. Great to see you, too.
Why is FDA approval not enough? Why do so many FDA-compliant shipments still end up creating customs problems at the border?
Well, so customs, to speak about that agency first, customs is one of the oldest agencies. It's what's identified in the Constitution. It's one of the oldest agencies in the country, along with the Postal Service. Right, been around for a long time. It has jurisdiction over everything that crosses the border, in and out. And back in the day, and I'm gonna say back in the day is like pre-NAFTA, so pre-92, I guess. A lot of the things that were consumed in this country were still made in the United States. And then NAFTA, now that was changing. And so pre-92, a lot of things were made here in the United States. That was already changing. But after NAFTA, then that resulted in a significant shift to the point now where a significant amount of cargo is actually imported. And now it's even more so. So customs has jurisdiction over a lot of things, and Customs Enforcement Authority and the requirements have increased over time. FDA requirements have also increased, but you can be in complete compliance with the Food and Drug Administration or U.S. Department of Agriculture or DEA or EPA and still have issues that are technical that relate only to customs enforcement. So compliance with one is great, and you should have that, but it's really important to make sure that you're covering all your bases.
Interesting, yeah. And so, pre-NAFTA then, I mean, there were probably fewer sort of interagency conflicts, right? Because like the FDA is an example, which is what we're talking about here, right? I might have been making my cosmetic product here in the States, and so it being customs compliant wouldn't even have been an issue, except on export.
Interesting question. So I started the FDA in 1986, pre-NAFTA. Now I was in the laboratory. I was a microbiologist. In 1990, I left the laboratory and I went down into the first floor of the building. I was at the Baltimore district office in Baltimore, Maryland, and the laboratory was the second story. And the first story was where the investigators and the compliance officers were. And I became a compliance officer because in the FDA, if you have 30 hours of hard science, you can do almost any job. And I had 30 hours of hard science. I was a scientist, along with everybody else. And so I went into compliance, and I went into import compliance. And this is 1990, pre-NAFTA. And there are these, I've talked about in other podcasts about what happens if FDA refuses cargo. The customs has a bond, and customs controls the after effect. And you've got to redeliver those goods, and customs has to be involved. And if you don't, then you got to pay customs liquidated damages. And a lot of times those cases were just dying because FDA and customs were not really working together. And so there was little coordination. And some of that was FDA's fault because FDA would get customs involved in cases, and then the importer would challenge the case, and customs was stuck defending FDA rules, and they didn't like that, and FDA wasn't supporting them, and so they stopped. Sort of like there was just a little less cooperation. Now, in about 92, 93, that started to change with NAFTA. By 98, 99, I became a criminal investigator, and then I left that job and went back to imports in Miami. And in Miami, by then, customs and FDA were co-housed in the same building. Like we had each other's combinations to the locks of each other's offices. Like that's how close the relationship had become. So, in a matter of 6 years or so, there was a lot of cooperation. But you're right, early, because there was so little, there's still plenty of imports, but nothing compared to what it is now, where the agency, the majority of what FDA regulates is either imported in whole or the raw materials, the main raw materials, whether it's the pharmaceutical active ingredient or critical components for medical devices manufactured overseas and brought in.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Good, interesting perspective, history on that. What about, what do you see as being the biggest differences between, how FDA evaluates imported products and how the CBP evaluates them.
So this is funny. This is sort of like a war story day. But all right. So customs, what do? Everything they do is at the border, right? I mean, they have
Right.
jurisdiction on imported goods, even if they make it through and they're into domestic commerce, they can go get them. But it gets far
Mm.
enough away that they can't really get them with as well with their administrative powers. Eventually, after time, they're going to have to use their law enforcement powers to go get them. And which is going to require them to go to a judge with a search warrant or something like that, or maybe do some administrative seizure or something. But it's more complicated. But everything they do is at the border because everything is crossing the border, and that's their jurisdiction. Now, in the FDA space, this is probably true, I think, largely with USDA in some respects too, because USDA mostly its job is to protect domestic agriculture. So the domestic part of the agency and the import part of the agencies are completely different, right? They actually think differently. They have different mandates, different responsibilities. And on the domestic side, they kind of like they treat the import side like it's not really that important, right? And yet it's the one place where the agency gets to look at anything at once because it's crossing the border, right? It's like the bottleneck. It's the perfect bottleneck to regulate the industry. Now, what's funny about it is I remember when I left FDA and went to private practice, I worked with a bunch of former FDA people that came from the older experiences, didn't have a lot of experience with imports. I had a lot of experience with imports, and they were sort of like playing down the import piece of like my background. At the same time, they had a customs and trade legal department that was full of attorneys, and guess what they do all the time? Imports. It's the only thing they do, right? There's an entire area in the law firm that generates revenue for the firm, but the domestic FDA people just weren't getting it. Now that's changed now because there's a lot more integration within the agency, realizing that you've got to address the stuff at the foreign supplier and the imports aspects, of the shipments if you're going to manage risk. So it's more integrated now, but it's still, there's still some of that, and it's true in USDA. In fact, so bad in USDA that in the USDA, the customs, the import inspectors were actually appropriated by Congress and put into Homeland Security. So USDA doesn't have import inspectors anymore. They're customs ag inspectors. They actually work for customs. So they actually broke that agency apart. And they tried to do it with FDA, but we fended them off. I was in FDA when 9/11 happened, and that's when Homeland Security was created. So yeah, little more history, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering, in terms of some specifics, can a shipment satisfy FDA requirements? I'm thinking, and still create major customs problems, right? I know that it can, but is it around tariffs, country of origin, valuation, admissibility? Is it all the above, or is it certain things sort of trend more than others?
Yeah, it can be anything. I will tell you that they're the top three things that the customs is focusing on is classification. That's the HTS code. Valuation, because duty is based upon those two items.
The duty,
right? And if there is if there is some kind of an exemption that's geographical or regional or based upon a treaty, origin. Right. So those three components, data components, are probably the most critical components. Now, it turns out from an FDA perspective, the FDA product code is connected to the HTS code, right? So you've got a mirror line up there. Evaluation, there is no similar correlation with valuation, although you might argue that approval, right, to the extent that an approver is required, arguably you could say that that's sort of like a substantive value to the shipment of the goods, even though it's not monetary, right? So I might make a parallel there. And then on the third portion in terms of origin, FDA does care where it comes from. They only care which country it comes from if there's a countrywide or a regional wide import alert, which there is sometimes.
Flag, something else.
So if there's a flag on a country for certain things like aquaculture, seafood coming from China, right? There's a flag on that. Or foods containing dairy proteins or vegetable proteins, or black pepper coming from India, right? That's a salmonella read national import alert. Then they care about origin.
That's right.
Right. Otherwise, when it comes to origin, they care about the manufacturer, right? And not the company, the site where it was made, the actual physical location. Now they care about who owns it, who the owner is of the
Of
facility, but you
course.
can have a
Yeah, they
contract
want to know what line
manufacturing.
it came
That's
off.
the one they care about.
Where do importers typically get blindsided? Because, the FDA requirements and the custom requirements are, they're looking at the same shipment through like a different lens, basically.
You didn't mention USDA, but a lot of times in the food space, that's where they get blindsided, and in the drug space too. And it's
Mm.
because USDA and FDA are both food agencies. Now, most of USDA is about protecting agriculture, but there is the Food Safety Inspection Service, the FSIS. And FSIS
Mhm.
is the USDA agency. Um, and now USDA and FDA they're not peers. USDA and HHS are peers because they're departments. FDA is an agency under HHS, FSIS is an agency under USDA. So FSIS and FDA are peers, and they're both responsible for food safety. But FSIS is responsible for food safety for foods that contain meat, right? Animal protein,
Mm.
more than 2%. Now, the more than 2% is not a rule. That's an agreement between the agencies as to how they're going to divide it up, right? So if you have a pizza that's a meat supreme and it's got more than 2% meat, USDA, FSIS has jurisdiction on food safety. Now, if it's a vegetable protein, a vegetable pizza, FDA, right? Because the percentage meat. Now, here's the thing. That question is only about which agency regulates it at the human level. It has nothing to do with whether a permit is required. A permit will definitely be required because it has meat. In fact, the vegetable
Mhm.
pizza might require a permit because it might have like a little bit of meat, or it may have some meat fat or some tallow
Yeah.
or something,
Uh,
that's
yeah.
protein. And so that's where they get
Manufactured in a
confused. There's a
facility with meat.
confusion
Yeah.
at customs and at USDA and then in the trade about how the USDA and FSIS and FDA work around. And the problem is customs enforces the USDA requirements when the goods arrive, and it kind of waits for FDA to worry about its problems after entry. So customs gets
Yeah.
right in the middle of all that mess.
Okay. So, speak to what goes wrong when companies handle FDA compliance and customs compliance separately, instead of treating, the import process as one uh, integrated risk area.
Yeah, that's a really, really good observation question. And here's where I see it the most is in pharmaceuticals and medical devices, the health related industries. Now, I do see it also in foods, but usually big corporate food, large food, right? And I don't mean like
Yeah.
big pieces of meat. I mean like large
No.
industry,
Like,
right?
yeah,
And here's why.
ConAgra.
Those organizations have enough resources that they can have or even need, like in the cases of drugs and medical devices, a very robust FDA regulatory compliance team in-house,
Mm,
right? And
right.
the people who are responsible for getting anything into the country, they're on the logistics team or the trade team. They're not on the compliance team, the regulatory compliance team.
Mhm.
They're on the trade compliance team. And they're kind of like, in a sense, it's like customs and FDA, which in many cases they don't, particularly when they were not talking together, right? They're not very well
Mhm.
integrated. It's true for a lot of law firms. The customs and trade team and the FDA team don't really talk. When I went to practice law for the first time, I went to the customs and trade meeting. I found out where it was. I went to the customs and trade attorney meeting. I was the first FDA attorney to ever go to one of those meetings because even in the law firms, they were segregated. And in the
Yeah.
industry, we have that problem because the FDA people are worried about the FDA approvals, the raw materials, whether they have investigational exemptions to bring in something for a clinical trial. That's all FDA. But when it crosses the border, you gotta tell the FDA the right information. And the people who do that are not the compliance people, it's the trade people, right? And
Trade
so
people.
there
Yeah.
can be a big disconnect there, which can create a lot of problems at the border.
Well, speak to this may be related, but when CBP starts digging into import records and discovers issues that extend beyond the original enforcement concern, what happens?
Well, it depends upon how bad it is, quite frankly, right?
Mm.
So, but
Right.
so
Right.
like
Fair
think
enough.
of the scope, right? I mean, customs is they get into something and they're asked a question about origin, and they're thinking about whether duties are required. And in the meantime, it's discovered that the product was not manufactured in the facility where they told FDA it was manufactured, right?
Yeah,
That's
back
the
to
problem. Here's another story. In the 90s, I get involved in a criminal investigation involving counterfeit active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs, that were coming out of China. And when FDA inspected an ingredient manufacturer, in order for that ingredient to be used to make a drug that's subject to an FDA approval, the value of that API coming from that facility tripled in the market immediately, overnight. Right. So if I'm in trade and I want to sell the same molecule, it might be an antibiotic or it may be like an anticonvulsive, it
Sure.
could be sort of anything, and I buy it from somebody else, but I put that guy's label on it, right? I can sell it for 3 times as much. That's a counterfeit. And it doesn't even have to be
Yeah.
trademarked. FDA's counterfeit definition is so broad, it doesn't require a trademark. And so in those circumstances, it was customs that brought that to us because they were doing a completely unrelated investigation. And for some reason, they decided to check something about the origin in terms of the facility and then check their own
Yeah.
records. And they came to us and said, we don't think this is the facility that's supposed to be shipping this. And we got into it. And sure enough, there was a very, very vast sort of conspiracy of product going to Hamburg and getting repackaged in a free trade
Yeah.
zone and then coming back over to the US.
But that wasn't what they were looking. What that was when CBP was looking for. They
Not at all.
stumbled
Now
upon
that
it.
was a criminal
Yeah, yeah.
case. Yeah, because the counterfeits were involved, right? But it didn't have to be that extreme. It really can just be the agencies working together and referring things back and forth. Electronic products, I see some of this also, where the agency, and that's because customs has in its own regulations the requirement to fill out an FDA form. It's one of the few places where an FDA form is actually in the Title 19. And it's pretty
Okay.
clever for FDA to get slipped that in because now it's a
Uh-huh.
customs violation to not complete an FDA form. And so I'll see it there too, because customs knows that rule.
Well, we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I'm wondering, for companies, right now, importing FDA-regulated goods on the regular, on the regular basis, what should an integrated FDA CBP compliance strategy look like operationally from your experience? What would be some tips, I guess?
So importers are required by customs to have SOPs for their import operations, right? They're supposed to have everything written down. Customs comes to do an inspection, you better have a system, right? The problem is usually that FDA has, the FDA compliance people have SOPs too, and they're not integrated. That's where you integrate it, right? You integrated 2 primary places. The purchase order. When I'm cutting a purchase order, that's when I evaluate all of my FDA and my customs compliance requirements. Do I know that everything is in compliance for both agencies before they ship it? Because if it's caught here, I've already wasted a ton of money and it might get destroyed or whatever. I have a headache. So the purchase order and then the actual SOPs need to build in the FDA requirements in the trade and importer SOPs. And that's something I do all the time, helping companies integrate these pieces. So they're operating as one brain rather than 2 people, which is a lot of times the way they operate.
Yeah, on different floors. Different floors of the proverbial office building, so to speak.
Indeed.
Well, Ben, good stuff. Thanks for your time and expertise, and another interesting conversation. I look forward to another one in the future.
Indeed, likewise. Good to see you.
That's it for today's episode of FDA Imports Cross-Border Compliance. Visit FDAImports.com if you want to learn more or connect directly with Ben and his team. Thanks for listening. We always appreciate a favorable review. You could subscribe to the show, maybe share a link with a colleague in the import-export business. We appreciate it. I'm Sean O'Connor. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.